They saw a burn on his uniform and assumed he was just old, forgotten, some leftover relic still clinging to ceremony. So they laughed, called him washed up, said he looked like he'd ironed his tunic with a landmine, but he never answered, never flinched, just stood there, silent, until a brigadier walked onto the square, stopped mid-step, and read the faded tag beneath his cuff, 3 words that made every cadet freeze. Turns out, that wasn't just a stain, it was residue from a mission no one talks about, because most of the men on it didn't make it back. The soldier they tried to humiliate, he didn't need to defend himself, because the moment that Brigadier spoke, every voice fell silent. Before we show you what happened next, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from, and if you think respect should be earned quietly, not demanded loudly. Now let's begin. The morning sun was still fighting through the London haze when Sergeant Major Reuben Maddox took his position in Wellington Barracks Courtyard. Around him, guardsmen stood like red pillars against the grey stone, their scarlet tunics pristine in the pale light. The air smelled of metal polish and old leather, mixed with that particular dampness that clung to military buildings, no matter how many decades they'd been standing. The sound of distant traffic filtered through the gates, mixing with the measured footsteps of guards changing positions and the soft clink of ceremonial swords against belt fittings. A few early tourists had already gathered beyond the railings, cameras ready, expecting the kind of show that made for good holiday photos. But there was something different about this morning. The other guards seemed to give Maddox a wider berth than usual, not out of disrespect, but something closer to reverence. They'd all heard fragments of stories, whispers in the mess hall, rumours that no one confirmed but no one denied either. Maddox's uniform was perfect too. Mostly. His boots gleamed like black mirrors, their leather so well maintained it looked like glass. His white gloves were spotless, fitted precisely to his hands, without a wrinkle or gap. Every brass button caught the light exactly as regulation demanded, polished to a mirror finish that spoke of hours spent in meticulous preparation. The red wool of his tunic was brushed to perfection, not a thread out of place, not a speck of dust anywhere. But there was something off about his tunic, something that made him stand out, even among men trained to be identical. Just above his belt, near the lowest brass button, was a dark stain. Not the kind you get from spilled tea or a careless moment with boot polish. This was something burned in, fused into the red wool like a scar that wouldn't heal. The fabric around it was slightly puckered, as if heat had grabbed it and refused to let go. The edges were darker than the centre, creating an almost flower-like pattern that suggested the source had been both intense and brief. Up close, you could see that efforts had been made to remove it. The surrounding wool was slightly faded, as if it had been scrubbed repeatedly with military precision. But whatever had caused the stain had bonded with the fibres at a molecular level, becoming part of the uniform's history rather than just a mark upon it. Some of the younger guards had learned not to ask about it. Others hadn't been there long enough to know better. The south gate clanged open with a metallic screech that echoed off the courtyard walls, and Captain Theo Berkeley strutted into the space like he owned the place. Behind him trailed a gaggle of army cadets, all early 20s with too much confidence and not enough sense to keep their mouths shut. They moved in that loose, chattering formation that screamed training exercise rather than anything resembling military discipline. Their uniforms were new, crisp from the supply depot, with creases so sharp they could cut paper. Their boots had the kind of shine that only came from never having walked through anything worse than a parade ground. Everything about them proclaimed inexperience. From the way they held themselves to the casual way they spoke, as if military service was just another university course to pass. Berkeley himself was the kind of officer who looked like he'd been pressed in a factory. Perfect hair combed back with mathematical precision, perfect posture that had been drilled into him at Sandhurst, perfect uniform that had never seen anything worse than a training ground. His belt buckle gleamed, his rank insignia caught the light just so, and his shoes reflected the morning sky like mirrors. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They swept the courtyard with the hungry look of someone hunting for flaws to point out, opportunities to demonstrate his own superiority. This wasn't inspection. This was performance. A chance to show his cadets how a real officer conducted himself, how authority worked in practice. When he spotted Maddox standing there, isolated but unmoving among the formation, something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe, or opportunity. One of the cadets behind him was already snickering. "Christ, look at the old-timer in the fancy dress. Uniform's seen better days, hasn't it?" "Looks like he's been storing his kit in a coal cellar," another added, pulling out his phone to get a closer shot of the stain. "This is going straight on Instagram. When keeping it real goes wrong." "Or maybe he just can't afford a new one on his pension," a third chimed in, loud enough that several nearby guards could hear. "Probably shopping at Army Surplus by now." "Bet he tells everyone at the pub about his glory days," another cadet added, mimicking an old man's voice. "Back in my day, we knew how to soldier properly. Cool." The laughter rippled through the group like a disease, each joke encouraging the next. Berkeley didn't stop it. If anything, his smirk encouraged it. He was enjoying this. The chance to look superior in front of his charges, to demonstrate his own relevance by pointing out someone else's apparent decline. "20 quid says he falls asleep standing up," one cadet whispered. "Nah, mate, look at that stain. Probably catches fire first." Maybe that's how he got it. Nodded off too close to a barbecue. More laughter. Crueler now. A few of the cadets were openly pointing, treating Maddox like a museum exhibit rather than a serving soldier. Their phones were out now, capturing what they assumed would be good material for sharing later. The kind of content that would get likes and laughs from mates back at base. Maddox didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on some point beyond the courtyard walls, as if the noise was just wind rustling through leaves. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. But anyone who'd spent real time around combat veterans might have noticed the way his fingers adjusted against his gloves, just slightly, just once. "That's what happens," Berkeley announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard loud enough for everyone to hear. "When you spend too long playing dress-up instead of doing real soldiering, gets confused about what century he's living in." More laughter. One cadet actually pointed at the stain and whispered something to his mate that made both of them nearly double over. Maddox's head turned, just a fraction. His eyes met Berkeley's for maybe half a second, not angry, not defensive, just measuring, the way a carpenter might look at a crooked nail. Then he looked away again, as if Berkeley wasn't worth the energy it would take to keep looking. That dismissal hit harder than any shouted response could have. Berkeley's smirk faltered for just a moment before he covered it with more bluster. "Right then," he said, his voice a little sharper now, "let's see what sort of drill you lot call professional." But the damage was done. That moment of dismissal had cracked something in the captain's confidence, and everyone had seen it happen. The morning drill began, with the familiar bark of commands echoing off stone walls, but there was something different about the way Maddox conducted it. He didn't shout, didn't bark orders like a drill instructor breaking down recruits. Instead, he moved through the formation like he was reading music only he could hear. His corrections were surgical in their precision. A slight touch to a shoulder here, a quiet word there, a gesture so subtle that anyone watching might miss it entirely. But the effect was immediate and dramatic. The guards moved with a precision that went beyond mere ceremony. This was something deeper, more instinctive. When he raised his hand, 30 men pivoted as one without any audible command. When he stepped left, the formation flowed around him like water finding its natural course. Every movement was economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that only came from men who'd learned to trust their leader's judgment completely. The visiting cadets gathered along the edge of the square, phones out, recording what they assumed would be good material for laughing about later. Most were still making jokes under their breath, but a few had gone quiet, starting to realize they were watching something beyond their experience. Captain Berkeley stood in their center, arms crossed, maintaining his air of superior amusement, but even his confidence was beginning to show hairline cracks. This wasn't what he'd expected to see. The precision was too real, too practiced. These weren't ceremonial movements, they were tactical, with an edge that suggested these men could switch from parade ground to battlefield without missing a beat. "Can't say I see the point of all this pageantry," he muttered to the nearest cadet. "More like theatre than military training, if you ask me." That's when Corporal Dean, one of the younger guards, drifted closer to the group of visitors. He was maybe 25, with the kind of quiet competence that comes from actually paying attention to the men around you. "You might want to dial it back a bit," he said under his breath to one of the taller cadets. The cadet turned, eyebrows raised. "Come again?" Dean nodded toward Maddox, who was checking the alignment of the front rank. "That stain you lot keep laughing about, it's not what you think it is." "Oh yeah?" The cadet grinned, sensing another opportunity for jokes. "What is it then? Sacred Guard tradition?" Dean's expression didn't change. His voice dropped lower, more serious. "Kandahar, Satchel Charge, took out a communications truck. He pulled the signals officer out before the second charge went off. Heat from the blast fused the residue into the fabric. They could never get it out." The cadet's grin started to fade. "You're having us on!" "3 other lads didn't make it out of that truck," Dean continued quietly. "He went back in twice before the whole thing went up. That stain, that's what's left of his mate's equipment, melting against him while he carried him to safety." "Am I?" Dean was already moving back toward the formation. "Ask him yourself if you've got the stones." The cadet leaned over to his mate and whispered what he'd heard, but the other one just laughed it off. "Right, secret war hero stories. What's next? He's got a medal from the Queen herself?" "Probably just wind up," the first cadet agreed, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Guards love their stories." But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The easy mockery was getting harder to maintain, like trying to laugh in a graveyard. Across the square, Maddox raised one hand and made a simple gesture. The entire front rank pivoted as one, their movements so synchronized they looked like parts of the same machine. Not the slow, ceremonial movements tourists expected, but something faster, more purposeful, military precision, with an edge that suggested these men could switch from parade ground to battlefield without missing a beat. Captain Berkeley, feeling his audience's attention starting to slip, decided to escalate. He'd come here to demonstrate authority, to show these cadets how a modern officer handled himself. He couldn't let some old-timer in a stained uniform steal his thunder. "Bit theatrical, don't you think, Sergeant Major?" he called out across the square, his voice carrying with practiced authority. Maddox didn't acknowledge him, didn't even shift his gaze. All that precision for what? Standing around looking pretty for the tourists? Berkeley took a few steps forward, making sure his voice would reach everyone in the courtyard. "Seems like a waste of training time to me." Still nothing. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for everyone except Maddox himself. "Maybe it's time to step aside and let someone with current experience take over," Berkeley continued, his voice growing more insistent. "Someone who's seen real action recently, before that uniform falls apart completely." A few of the guards exchanged glances. They'd never seen anyone speak to the sergeant major like this. The disrespect was so blatant, so public, that it felt almost surreal. Now Maddox moved. He turned slowly, deliberately, until he was facing Berkeley directly. The movement was economical, controlled, like a gun turret rotating to acquire a target. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning air like a blade. "Only part of me that ever burned," he said, touching the stain briefly with one gloved finger. The rest kept moving. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't even really a response to the insult. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that comes from having survived things that would break other men. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that no one quite understood, but everyone felt. The courtyard went quiet. Even the cadets stopped their whispering. One of them, a sharp-eyed kid who'd been paying more attention than the rest, caught sight of something as the wind pushed back Maddox's cuff. There, barely visible against the red fabric, were faded letters and numbers that looked like they'd been burned in rather than sewn. 3C Phantom Signal. "What's that say?" he whispered to the cadet next to him. 3C something. Phantom Signal. Never heard of it? Probably just his old unit or something. Guard designation. Or his Call of Duty clan name. Another one snorted, but the laughter that followed was thin and forced. Captain Berkeley had caught the exchange and sensed an opportunity to regain control of the situation. "What's that supposed to be then, Sergeant Major?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some sort of special ceremonial unit? 3C Phantom Signal?" He said the words with mock reverence, like he was announcing a joke. "Sounds like something from a video game," one of the cadets added, "or a weekend war reenactment group." The laughter came back, but it felt forced now, like whistling past a graveyard. Maddox simply adjusted his cuff to cover the marking and said nothing. But something in his silence, the weight of it, the completeness, made the jokes feel hollow. Men who had nothing to prove didn't need to defend themselves against boys who had nothing to lose. That's when the atmosphere in the courtyard changed completely. Footsteps echoed from the rear entrance, confident, measured, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Conversations died. The guards straightened without being told. Even the cadets found themselves standing a little taller. Brigadier Charles Lennox walked into the courtyard like he owned it, which in a way he did. Grey-haired, weathered, with the kind of presence that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. His aide followed 2 paces behind, but the Brigadier's attention was already focused, scanning the courtyard with eyes that missed nothing. He'd been expecting to conduct a routine inspection, maybe offer some guidance to the visiting cadets. His mind was on scheduling, on the paperwork waiting on his desk, on the dozen small administrative tasks that filled a senior officer's day. When his gaze landed on Maddox, he stopped walking. For a moment, the Brigadier's face went completely blank, the look of a man trying to process something that shouldn't be possible. His eyes moved from Maddox's profile to the stain on his tunic, then back to his face. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking through clouds. The entire courtyard held its breath. Behind the Brigadier, his aide noticed the sudden halt, but didn't understand its significance. The cadets shifted nervously, sensing that something important was happening, but not knowing what. Even Maddox seemed to sense the scrutiny, though he didn't turn to meet it. Lennox stared at Maddox's face, then at the stain on his tunic, then at the barely visible marking on his cuff. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to read. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been relief. When he spoke, his voice carried across the sudden silence like a stone dropped into still water. "I thought you were dead." Maddox's posture didn't change, but when he responded, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. "We were told to disappear," he said quietly. "I just didn't disappear far enough." The Brigadier stepped closer, his boots echoing on the stone. "Christ! Phantom Signal!" The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. The cadets who had been laughing about the designation suddenly looked like they wanted to crawl under the nearest rock. Without asking permission, Lennox reached for Maddox's cuff and turned it slightly, revealing the faded marking more clearly. The letters were barely there, worn away by years and washing, but still readable if you knew what to look for. 3C Phantom Signal. SS Black Echo. Verified. No feed. A murmur went through the watching soldiers like wind through wheat. The cadets stared in stunned silence. Captain Berkeley looked like someone had just told him his entire career was a mistake. Helmand Province, the Brigadier said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness. Supply convoy ambush. South sector. Intelligence said 6 hostiles. Turned out to be more like 30. No satellite coverage, no drone support, no communications. Maddox gave the smallest possible nod. "We didn't lose the trucks," he said. "We lost the feed. Went in anyway." Lennox's eyes were distant now, remembering. "I read the after-action report. What wasn't classified to hell and back anyway?" "You read the sanitized version?" Maddox corrected. "Of course I did." The Brigadier almost smiled. "The real one would have gotten half the chain of command court-martialed." A long pause settled over the courtyard. Then Lennox turned to face the cadets directly. "You lot know what phantom signal was?" Blank stares all around. "Didn't think so." He turned his attention to Captain Berkeley, who looked like he was experiencing his own personal apocalypse. "That stain you were having such a good laugh about, that's ammonium nitrate residue. Burned into the fabric when his load-bearing gear melted, after the first satchel charge hit the communications truck." Berkeley tried to speak, but nothing came out. "You see," Lennox continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a particularly important lecture, "phantom signal wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't reserve duty. It was full-spectrum reconnaissance for situations where conventional intelligence gathering had failed and men were going to die if someone didn't act on incomplete information." He gestured toward Maddox, but his eyes remained fixed on the cadets. "When that convoy lost satellite feed and found itself in a kill zone with no way out, this man didn't wait for orders from headquarters. He didn't request backup or additional intelligence. He went in on foot, alone, carrying nothing but basic kit and the kind of experience you can't learn in any school." The Brigadier's voice dropped, becoming more intimate, but somehow carrying even further. 37 vehicles, fuel trucks, supply convoys, medical transports, men, women, civilians contracted to keep the war machine running. All of them sitting ducks in a valley that had turned into a shooting gallery. He paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle. The official record shows a successful mission with minimal casualties. What it doesn't show is that 4 men from Phantom Signal never made it home. What it doesn't show is that Sergeant Major Maddox carried encrypted intelligence under his body armour for 18 hours because external storage had been compromised and discovery would have meant torture before death. The courtyard was so quiet you could hear the pigeons roosting in the eaves, the distant rumble of London traffic, the soft whisper of wind through the stone archways. What it doesn't show is that when the secondary ambush detonated, the one that should have killed everyone who'd made it past the first, he dragged a 19-year-old signals officer 300 metres to safety while taking shrapnel from his own melting equipment. What it doesn't show is that he went back for 2 more before the ammunition in that truck started cooking off. Lennox's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but every word carried like a gunshot. And when the dust settled, and the mission was scrubbed from official records because it was too sensitive to acknowledge publicly, he kept wearing that same uniform. Because forgetting isn't an option when you're the only one left to remember their names. He turned to face Berkeley directly. "And you, Captain, called him a relic." Berkeley's face had gone white. "Sir, I didn't realise—" "You didn't realise because you didn't ask," Lennox cut him off. "You saw a stain and assumed incompetence. You saw an older soldier and assumed irrelevance. You heard a unit designation and assumed it was a joke." The Brigadier stepped closer to the cadets. "Do you understand what you've been laughing at? This man has more operational experience in his little finger than your entire training class combined. He's forgotten more about real soldiering than most of you will ever learn." One of the cadets, the one who'd first spotted the unit marking, found his voice. "Sir, was he really part of the Black Echo operation?" Lennox didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned back to Maddox. "You kept the tags," he said softly. "Kept what mattered," Maddox replied. Without another word, the Brigadier stepped back half a pace and brought his hand up in a sharp, formal salute. Not the kind of salute you give to a rank or a position, but the kind you give to a man who's earned something that can't be taken away. Every person in that courtyard understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't protocol. This was recognition. Respect, given where respect was due, regardless of current rank or assignment. Maddox didn't return the salute in the traditional sense. He simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow carried more weight than any formal response could have managed. When the Brigadier's hand dropped, the silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then he turned to address the entire gathering. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, "you've just had a lesson in why we never judge a soldier by his current assignment, why we never assume we know a man's story based on what we can see from the outside." He looked directly at Captain Berkeley. "And why the smartest thing an inexperienced officer can do is keep his mouth shut and his ears open when he's in the presence of men who've already walked through fire." Berkeley looked like he wanted to sink through the stone floor. None of his cadets were meeting his eyes. The Brigadier checked his watch and turned to go, but paused at the courtyard entrance. "Still carrying it, aren't you?" he called back to Maddox. Maddox's reply was quiet but clear. "Until someone else is ready to." Then, without waiting for permission that he'd never needed, he raised one hand in a simple gesture. The guards snapped to attention as one, their movement so precise it sounded like a single boot hitting stone. As the formation began their final drill of the morning, something had fundamentally changed in the courtyard. The cadets watched in complete silence, no longer seeing a ceremonial display, but witnessing something much more significant. These weren't toy soldiers performing for tourists. These were professionals, being led by a man who'd earned his authority in places most people couldn't imagine. Captain Berkeley stood frozen at the edge of the square, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He'd come here to show off in front of his cadets, to demonstrate his own importance by diminishing someone else's. Instead, he'd learned a lesson about assumptions that would follow him for the rest of his career. The guards moved through their routine with a precision that was almost supernatural. Every step, every turn, every rifle movement was executed with the kind of perfection that only came from absolute trust in leadership. They weren't just following orders, they were expressing confidence in the man giving them. When the drill ended, Maddox didn't acknowledge the scattered applause from the few tourists who'd gathered to watch. He simply adjusted his gloves, checked his position, and prepared for the next phase of the day. Professional. Unshakable. Exactly what he'd always been. The cadets filed out of the courtyard in complete silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. Several kept glancing back at Maddox, as if trying to reconcile the man they'd mocked with the soldier they'd just learned about. A few looked genuinely ashamed. These were decent kids who'd gotten caught up in the pack mentality, and now they understood what they'd been laughing at. Captain Berkeley lingered at the edge of the square, looking lost. His carefully constructed image of authority had been demolished in a matter of minutes, and he seemed unsure of how to proceed. The cadets who'd been hanging on his every word that morning now avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with being associated with his humiliation. One of the younger cadets, the one who'd first spotted the unit marking, approached Dean as the guards prepared to disperse. "Was all that true?" he asked quietly. "About Phantom Signal?" Dean looked at him for a long moment. "Some stories don't get told," he said finally. "But the ones that do, they're usually the smallest part of what really happened." As the courtyard emptied, Maddox remained at his post. The stain on his tunic caught the light the same way it had that morning, but now everyone who saw it understood what it really represented. Not a flaw or a failure to maintain standards, but a mark of honour worn by a man who'd earned the right to carry the memory of those who couldn't. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the London haze, and Wellington Barracks settled back into its daily rhythm. But something had changed. A story had been told without being spoken, a lesson had been learned without being taught, and respect had been given where it was due. Because in the end, that's what real leadership looks like. Not the loud performance of authority, but the quiet certainty of competence. Not the need to prove yourself, but the willingness to let your work speak for itself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone who understands the weight of what you've carried will be there to make sure the story doesn't disappear with you. Do you think Captain Berkeley learned his lesson, or will he make the same mistake again? Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearances only to discover their true story later? If this story reminded you to look deeper before passing judgment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in giving respect where it's earned, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The next story starts in just a moment. Same courage, different uniform. We'll see you there.